For the past 9 years, I have eaten food from my backyard every single day. Not as a hobby, not as a summer project, and not as a way to save a little money on groceries when tomatoes happen to be in season. Every day. Fresh salads in spring, berries through summer, apples and nuts in autumn, preserved fruit in winter, and root crops dug from the soil when frost covers everything else. And the surprising part is this system was not built with expensive raised beds, automated irrigation, or acres of land. In its first year, I spent less than $300 establishing it, and ever since then, it has continued producing food with surprisingly little additional investment. But when I first started gardening, nobody warned me about the real reason so many backyard food projects quietly disappear after only a few seasons. People often blame poor soil, bad weather, pests, lack of time. Yet those problems rarely destroy a food system on their own. The biggest mistake is much simpler. Most backyard gardens are designed like temporary projects. They consist of neat rows of annual vegetables planted in spring, harvested in summer, and removed in autumn, only to be rebuilt from the beginning the following year. The gardener works hard every season, but the garden itself never becomes more capable, more productive, or easier to maintain. It consumes labor without accumulating value. Eventually, many people become exhausted and give up. I used to garden exactly that way, till I began looking at productive ecosystems that already exist in nature. A mature woodland does not restart itself every spring. It grows more resilient over time. Each layer supports the others. Sunlight is captured at different heights. Nutrients cycle naturally. Organic matter continually improves the soil. And most importantly, the system becomes increasingly productive as it ages. That observation completely changed the way I think about growing food. Instead of building a garden, I began building a layered ecosystem. 5 distinct levels of food production occupying the same footprint. 5 layers performing different functions. 5 layers cooperating to create a system that gradually shifts from requiring constant effort to generating reliable harvests year after year. It is not a method designed around one growing season. It is a strategy designed around decades. And once you begin thinking in decades instead of months, the entire backyard starts to look very different. Before we get into the first layer itself, it helps to understand why this approach consistently outperforms a traditional vegetable patch. The idea comes from observing one of the most efficient food-producing systems on Earth. Not a commercial farm, not a greenhouse, a forest. Walk through an old woodland, and you will notice something interesting. Plants are not fighting to occupy a single horizontal plane. Instead, they divide space vertically. Tall trees stretch upward to capture intense sunlight. Smaller trees occupy the filtered light beneath them. Shrubs fill the gaps. Ground-hugging plants spread across the surface. Roots and tubers quietly store energy underground. Almost every inch of available space is being used. Ecologists have long recognized that natural ecosystems achieve remarkable productivity because they stack functions together. Sunlight intercepted by a tree canopy is not wasted. Moisture retained by shade benefits plants below. Fallen leaves become future fertility. Deep roots recycle minerals from soil layers that annual crops rarely reach. Compare that with a conventional vegetable bed. Most vegetables grow within a narrow height range. They compete for the same sunlight. They require irrigation during dry spells. And after harvest, much of the bed sits empty for months. In many cases, gardeners are only utilizing a small fraction of the biological potential that a piece of ground can offer. That realization led me to begin with the most important investment in the entire system, the canopy layer. I planted 3 fruit trees, an apple, a pear, and a plum. Not mature trees, not expensive specimens, just inexpensive bare root saplings planted during winter into an ordinary patch of lawn. At the time, it felt almost disappointing. Thin sticks. No fruit, no shade, no visible reward. But perennial systems ask for patience upfront and repay it with consistency later. 9 years after planting, those same trees produce well over 100 pounds of fruit in a typical season. The apples begin ripening in late summer and can often be stored into winter under cool conditions. Pears are bottled, dried, or preserved. Plums become jam, frozen desserts, or fruit leather. But the harvest is only part of their value. The canopy moderates temperature extremes. Its shade reduces evaporation during heat waves. Roots penetrate deeply into the subsoil, accessing nutrients unavailable to shallow-rooted crops. Each autumn, falling leaves return organic matter to the surface, gradually improving soil structure and microbial activity. In other words, these trees do far more than produce fruit. They create the environmental conditions that allow every other layer in the system to thrive. And that is why I now believe that if someone only takes one idea from this entire method, it should be this: plant the canopy first. Because the tree planted this winter starts counting down toward its first meaningful harvest today. The tree planted next winter begins that journey a year later. And over a 30-year lifespan, those lost seasons add up far more than most people realize. While the canopy layer is busy establishing itself, there is no reason to spend years simply waiting for fruit trees to mature. That is where the understory comes in. This second layer occupies the middle space between the tall canopy overhead and the productive ground beneath. It is designed to provide earlier harvests, additional biodiversity, and useful materials for the rest of the system. For me, the understory revolves around 3 plants: hazelnut, fig, and elder. Each serves a very different purpose, but together they bridge the gap between short-term abundance and long-term productivity. The hazelnut is arguably the most valuable shrub in the entire design. And like soft fruits, nuts offer something many backyard systems lack: concentrated calories. A mature hazel can yield several pounds of nuts each autumn, providing a shelf-stable food source that stores naturally for months. But its contribution goes far beyond food. Hazel responds exceptionally well to coppicing, a traditional pruning method where stems are periodically cut back to encourage new growth. Those straight, flexible stems become free bean poles, tomato stakes, pea supports, and trellising material for the garden. In effect, the plant supplies both nutrition and infrastructure. Nearby, a fig tree benefits from the reflected warmth of a south-facing wall, creating a small microclimate that extends the growing season and improves fruit ripening, even in cooler regions. The elder is perhaps the most underestimated member of this layer. Its fragrant flowers appear in early summer and can be transformed into syrups or cordials, while the dark berries later in the season have long been used in traditional preserves and beverages. One of the greatest advantages of the understory is timing. Most shrubs begin producing meaningful harvests within 3 to 5 years, often long before fruit trees reach their peak. That staggered timeline is intentional. In a well-designed perennial system, you are never waiting for everything to happen at once. Something is always growing, something is always maturing, and most importantly, something is always coming home to the kitchen. By the time the canopy begins establishing itself and the understory shrubs settle into place, something remarkable starts to happen. The garden no longer feels like a collection of individual plants. It begins to function like an ecosystem. And nowhere is that transformation more obvious than in the shrub layer. This is the stage where many visitors to my garden stop walking, look around, and ask the same question. How can this much fruit possibly come from such a small space? The answer lies in perennial soft fruits. Unlike annual vegetables that demand reseeding every year, berry-producing shrubs are long-term investments. Once established, many varieties can remain productive for 15 to 20 years with little more than occasional pruning and an annual application of compost. My shrub layer is built around 4 dependable performers: blackcurrants, gooseberries, raspberries, and blackberries. Each one occupies a different window in the harvest calendar, creating an almost uninterrupted sequence of fresh fruit. Gooseberries are usually the first to arrive. By early summer, when stored winter foods are running low and the new season is only beginning, their tart fruits provide one of the earliest sweet harvests of the year. Shortly afterward, blackcurrants take over. Rich in vitamin C and antioxidants, they are ideal for syrups, cordials, jams, and freezing. A few mature bushes can easily supply enough fruit for months of homemade preserves. Raspberries extend the season even further. By combining summer fruiting and autumn fruiting varieties, it becomes possible to harvest fresh berries over several months rather than a few short weeks. Then come the blackberries. Often overlooked because they grow wild in many regions, cultivated varieties offer larger fruits, improved yields, and reliable harvests stretching well into early autumn. What makes this layer truly powerful is not simply the quantity of fruit. It is the rhythm. Every few weeks, something new ripens. A bowl of gooseberries in June, fresh raspberries in July, blackcurrants filling jars in midsummer, blackberries arriving just as summer begins to fade. By the end of the season, the freezer is stocked, pantry shelves are lined with preserves, and the need to purchase processed fruit products almost disappears. At this stage, abundance no longer feels like a goal. It simply becomes part of the yearly routine. If the canopy provides the long-term structure and the shrub layers create seasonal abundance, the ground layer is where the system truly begins paying for itself. This is the layer responsible for the largest volume of food harvested throughout the year. It is also the layer that changes the way most people think about vegetable gardening. Traditionally, vegetable beds are designed as rows of annual crops. Seeds are sown each spring. Plants are harvested during summer. The beds are cleared in autumn. Then the entire process starts again. There is nothing inherently wrong with that approach, but it requires a significant amount of repeated labor, and every season begins at almost the same point as the one before it. I wanted something different. I wanted the garden to become easier to manage over time rather than more demanding. That led me toward perennial vegetables. At first, I was skeptical. Like many gardeners, I grew up assuming that nearly all vegetables needed to be replanted every year. Then, I harvested asparagus for the first time. 3 years earlier, I had planted a handful of crowns into the soil with no immediate reward. 4 years, they simply occupied space. Then one spring, thick green spears suddenly emerged. I harvested them for several weeks, allowed the foliage to mature through summer, and the following spring, they returned again, year after year, without reseeding, without transplanting, without buying anything new. Many well-maintained asparagus beds remain productive for 15 to 20 years, and some last considerably longer. That experience completely changed my perspective. I began adding other perennial vegetables to the system. Perennial kale now supplies fresh leaves throughout the cooler months when many annual crops struggle. Globe artichokes produce edible flower buds during summer while simultaneously improving soil structure with their extensive root systems. Along the edges of beds, wild strawberries spread naturally, acting as living mulch. They shade the soil, reduce weed pressure, retain moisture, and reward that service with handfuls of intensely flavored fruit over several months. Between these permanent residents, I still grow annual vegetables, but now they function as guests rather than tenants. Salad greens fill temporary gaps. Radishes mature quickly before larger plants expand. Spring onions occupy narrow spaces. Courgettes and squash take advantage of sunny openings. Climbing beans rise upward into the shrub layer above, effectively connecting to productive levels together. This blending of perennial and annual crops dramatically increases the amount of food harvested from a relatively modest area. Even more importantly, it spreads risk. If one crop performs poorly because of pests, heat, or excessive rain, another often succeeds. There is rarely a season with complete failure. Instead of depending on a handful of major harvests, the ground layer provides dozens of smaller harvests distributed across the calendar. A basket of salad leaves this week. Asparagus next month. Artichokes in midsummer. Perennial kale during winter. Strawberries appearing unexpectedly along the pathways. At some point, the garden stops feeling like a place where food is grown. It starts feeling like a pantry that simply happens to be outdoors. If the ground layer keeps the kitchen supplied week after week, the fifth layer serves a completely different purpose. It is not designed for convenience. It is designed for security. Because one lesson every food grower eventually learns is that some seasons simply do not go according to plan. Late frosts damage blossoms. Heat waves slow leafy crops. Heavy rains encourage disease. And occasionally, entire harvests disappear despite your best efforts. That is why I consider the root layer to be the insurance policy of the entire system. And like most vegetables, these crops remain hidden underground, protected from wind, excessive heat, and many of the problems that affect plants growing above the soil surface. At the center of my root layer are Jerusalem artichokes. Several years ago, I planted a few tubers in a neglected corner that received only partial sunlight. I had very low expectations. Instead, they turned into one of the most dependable crops I have ever grown. Every summer, the plants shoot upward into a dense wall of foliage, often reaching impressive heights. Beneath the soil, they steadily develop dozens of crisp, sweet tubers that can be harvested gradually throughout autumn and winter. The greatest advantage is storage. There is no cellar to maintain, no drying process, no preservation equipment. The soil itself becomes the storage container. I simply dig up what I need and leave the rest undisturbed until the next harvest. Even forgotten tubers become future plants, allowing the patch to regenerate almost effortlessly. Alongside them, I grow oca, a traditional Andean root crop that produces colorful tubers late in the season, helping extend fresh harvests into early winter. A small patch of horseradish occupies another corner, supplying roots for sauces, pickling, and preserving long after many other vegetables have disappeared from the garden. This layer provides something more valuable than yield. It provides confidence. A difficult summer may reduce tomato production. Excessive rainfall may damage onions in storage. But crops hidden safely beneath the surface often continue growing unaffected. And over the years, I have realized that resilience is not built by relying on a single successful harvest. It comes from designing a system where food is always waiting somewhere, even if you have to dig a little deeper to find it. When people hear about a 5-layer food system, they often imagine a massive project that requires years of work before anything useful happens. The reality is almost the opposite. The system is designed to reward progress at every stage. Year 1 is surprisingly simple. Plant your fruit trees. Choose your canopy. Add a hazel shrub. Prepare a few productive beds for annual vegetables. The financial investment is modest, but the psychological shift is enormous. For the first time, you are no longer planting for next summer. You are planting for the next 3 decades. By year 2, the garden already starts looking different. Soft fruit shrubs move in. Perennial vegetables establish themselves. Jerusalem artichokes begin colonizing unused corners. The first layers start overlapping, and the space feels less like a collection of beds and more like a living community of plants. By year 3, the rewards become tangible. Asparagus pushes through the soil each spring without being asked. Berry bushes provide their first meaningful harvests. The structure of the ecosystem becomes visible. You are no longer building a garden. You are managing momentum. Around year 5, many of the original investments reach maturity. Fruit trees begin producing substantial crops. Hazelnuts arrive each autumn. Soft fruits peak in productivity. Maintenance gradually declines while harvests continue increasing. Tasks that once occupied entire weekends may eventually require only a few hours spread across the week. Then comes year 10. At this stage, the layers begin supporting one another almost automatically. Leaves falling from trees feed the soil. Ground covers suppress weeds. Deep roots improve drainage and nutrient cycling. The system becomes increasingly self-regulating. And by year 30, something extraordinary happens. The apple tree planted decades earlier is still producing fruit. Asparagus beds are entering some of their most productive years. Berry bushes have been divided, shared, and replanted. Jerusalem artichokes continue emerging every spring as if time barely matters. Looking back, I realized that my old vegetable garden resembled renting a house. Every season demanded new investment. More digging. More purchases. More rebuilding. Very little accumulated. This system feels different. It feels like ownership. Every tree becomes an appreciating asset. Every perennial adds compound returns. Every established root crop becomes a reserve you can rely on. You do not need a large farm. You do not need expensive equipment. You simply need the willingness to think beyond a single growing season. Because the best time to plant that first tree may have been 20 years ago. But the second best time is still this winter. And 30 years from now, someone will still be harvesting food from the decision you make today.